It's late, I know, but I'm glad you're here. Tonight's story drifts behind the cloister walls of a medieval monastery into a life most of us were never meant to understand. No talking, no heat, no escape. Just ink-stained fingers, rats in the rafters, and the ever-present hush of God's waiting room. This is not a tale of saints or martyrs. It's about the ones who stayed behind, who prayed through hunger, copied through fevers, and sometimes died in silence. So if you've ever felt burnt out by your inbox, or suffocated by the quiet ache of routine, this one's for you. Subscribe if you'd like, but only if it feels like something real. I'd love to know where you're listening from, or what time it is for you. Now let's begin. Dim the lights, and let's drift back in time. There was a time when silence was not a lack, but a rule. The year is somewhere between the 12th and 14th century. No one remembers exactly, because time bends differently in places like this. The monastery sits on a foggy slope in what is now northern France. Its stone bones nestled into the landscape like it was always meant to be. They're cold, weather-beaten, unmoving. Inside, everything is quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not the gentle hush of snowfall or the sleepy lull of a village night. No, this is the silence of intention. A willed, weighed, worn silence. The kind that accumulates like dust in corners, thickens in the throat, and settles in the lungs. The monk will follow his name doesn't matter, and maybe that's the point. Is 36 years old and already considered old. His fingers are crooked from cold mornings and cramped script. He hasn't spoken a full sentence aloud in weeks. Not because he has nothing to say, but because that is the rule. Vows once spoken are rarely repeated. Silence, poverty, obedience. The trifecta of spiritual athleticism. To give up everything and still wake up hungry for grace. At dawn, he rises without ceremony. The bell tolls faintly its sound, muffled by frost. He wraps himself in wool that smells of wood smoke and mildew, and shuffles into the stone chapel. The air inside is colder than the air outside. That's not a metaphor. He kneels. He doesn't pray for strength. He doesn't pray for joy. He prays, instead, that he might not fall asleep during matins. A reasonable request. You might think this life would be calming, predictable, spiritually serene, but that would be a mistake. There is an ache that grows when every day repeats itself perfectly. The boredom is not benign, is holy, and it is punishing. He's not here to be entertained. He's here to be sanctified by tedium. Because if God sees everything, then God sees him spill the ink. God sees him fight sleep. God sees him trying not to kill the mouse that keeps chewing at the corner of his mattress. God sees the small humiliations and counts them as prayer. And so he carries on. He copies a page. He makes an error. He crosses it out carefully and keeps going. He does not raise his voice when the broth is sour. He does not curse when the ink freezes in the pot. He just keeps going. Sometimes we think history belongs to the warriors and the kings, but maybe it belongs just as much to the ones who endured things slowly, who lived lives of such quiet repetition that the world forgot to notice, but the rats noticed, and the cold noticed, and the silence. The silence noticed everything. There is a book in the scriptorium, worn, hand-stitched, and absurdly specific. It's called The Rule of Saint Benedict, and for our monk, it is not just a guide. It is gravity. It decides when he wakes, when he eats, when he may speak, and most critically, when he may not. Benedict, bless his austere little heart, believed that discipline was a form of love. Not punishment, not dominance, but love. And like most old-world ideas of love, it demanded a great deal of sacrifice. The rule said a monk should keep his eyes lowered. The rule said the bed should be hard. The rule said laughter was suspicious. The rule, in short, had opinions about everything from socks to soup. To modern ears, it might sound absurd, but imagine for a moment that you live in a world of chaos. Plagues sweep in like ghosts. War is a season, not an event. Your neighbor might be a witch, or a heretic, or just someone who coughs too much. Life is loud, life is short, life is cruel, so you join a monastery. You enter a space where the chaos stops at the gate, where every moment is preordained, where obedience is not weakness, but survival. In this world, order is not just sacred, it is a shield. Our monklets call him Laurent, just for the sake of familiarity, has not seen a woman in 5 years. He does not remember the last time he heard music with rhythm. He recites psalms like breathing, mechanical and mournful, each syllable a little funeral for the self. He fasts twice a week, not for weight or virtue, but to remember hunger as a teacher. He gardens with calloused fingers. He mends torn robes. He sharpens quills. He copies the same passage 3 times, because the abbot wants 3 copies. And in the silence, a strange thing happens. Time stretches. Thoughts grow louder. The self becomes both magnified and erased. There are days Laurent forgets what his voice sounds like. Sometimes he opens his mouth to yawn and surprises himself. The sound is too human, too familiar, too alive. He wonders not out loud, never out loud, what his life might have been had he not chosen this. Or, perhaps more truthfully, had this not been chosen for him. Because not every monk came here out of piety. Some were orphaned, some were political inconveniences, some were the extra sons useless to inheritance, unwanted at home. The monastery was sanctuary and exile, both. And yet, Laurent does not complain, not because he is happy, but because happiness was never the point. Obedience was. And so, he folds the blanket just so. He washes his hands in water that bites. He bows his head when the abbot walks by, and when the bell rings for vespers, he goes. Because the rule does not care how you feel, it only cares that you show up. There is a corner of the monastery that even the sun forgets, a low, damp corridor that slopes toward the earth like it's trying to disappear. This is the scriptorium where words are born again, over and over, in the scratch of quills and the shuffle of robes. Laurent spends much of his day here. The walls sweat in winter. The windows are little more than slits. And yet, it is in this dim room that some of the most delicate acts of resurrection take place. Every copied word is a tiny defiance of time. Every letter, a whispered refusal to let something be lost. But let's be honest, it's not romantic. The ink stains, the backaches, the candles are never enough, and the manuscripts, they're not all glorious gospels or dazzling tales. Sometimes it's a legal charter, sometimes a sermon, sometimes a tax record so dry it might as well have been written on dust. Laurent writes, anyway, carefully, devoutly, because the labor is the prayer. Each page takes hours. Some days, a particularly ornate capital might demand an entire afternoon and a steady hand, even if that hand is shivering from cold. He sharpens the quill with a small penknife, just enough to slice through parchment, but not too much to splinter. It's a skill born of repetition, not creativity. He doesn't sign his work. Of course not. These pages aren't his. Nothing here is. But sometimes, in the margins, he leaves a mark. A tiny doodle, a face, A rabbit with 2 long ears. A comment in Latin that reads, "This page was hard to write." Not exactly rebellious, but in a world where names are erased and personalities discouraged, even a sigh in ink feels subversive. And if you look closely, across centuries and preservation efforts, you can still find them. The monk's breath caught in the fibers. The quiet defiance of being slightly more human than the rules allowed. Outside the scriptorium, the world is fracturing. Peasants revolt. Nobles scheme. Cities fester. And soon the plague will come knocking. But in here, the only war is against time, and time is patient. It blunts the quill. It dries the ink. It forgets the names. But still, the monk writes, because someone must remember, even if they're not allowed to say it out loud. The monastery has a rat problem. Not the poetic kind, the metaphorical rot of the soul, the slow decay of joy under obedience, though that too. No, these are very literal rats, thick-bodied, clever little thieves with glossy black eyes and no sense of monastic decorum. They live in the walls. They dart across the cloister garden when they think no one is looking. They chew through sacks of barley. They steal the ends of candles. They build their own tiny empire in the cracks between stones. Laurent sees them daily. One of them he's named. Not officially, of course. Naming things is attachment, and attachment is a risk. But still, this one is different, greyer than the rest. A little limp in its back leg, comes out only when the bells ring for none. Laurent calls it Augustine. Augustine, the rat. He doesn't tell anyone. It would be a foolish thing to confess. The rule does not include provisions for rodent friendship. But in the deep, repetitive quiet of cloistered life, even a rat becomes a sort of company, a shared routine, a flicker of movement in a place where even birds have learned to stay quiet. Augustine appears when Laurent scrapes his bowl after dinner, always at the same time, always with the same patient boldness, like he too is following a rule, a routine, a sacred rhythm passed down through generations of rodents. It's not much, but it helps. There are moments, brief, ridiculous ones, when Laurent imagines the rat is praying with him, bowing its tiny head at the right time, offering its small life to some unknowable rodent god. And then Augustine scurries off with a crust of bread and the moment breaks. It is silly, maybe, but when you spend your days buried in ink, fasting through fevers, and walking barefoot over cold stone, you learn to hold on to whatever flickers of life pass through the gloom, even if it's a rat. Especially if it's a rat. Laurent once read a passage in a sermon about how all creatures praise the Lord. Birds in their song, lions in their roar, fish in their swimming. He wonders if rats praise him too, not with hymns, but with persistence, with survival, with knowing exactly where the monks keep their cheese. He smiles at that thought just a little, just enough for it to pass through like a draft. Then it's gone. Smiling isn't forbidden, but it is discouraged. Too much of the self in it. Still, for a moment, the scriptorium feels warmer. And that night, in the candle's dying glow, Laurent copies a psalm with unusual care. The line reads, "Even the sparrow finds a home, and the swallow a nest for herself." He glances at the wall where Augustine has vanished again, where she may lay her young at your altars. Perhaps there's room for rats, too. The monastery is not designed for change. Its walls are thick, its schedules rigid, its prayers old enough to outlive kingdoms. It floats on its rituals like a boat in deep fog, safe, sealed, drifting from the chaos beyond its gates. But even here, the world leaks in. It begins with the messenger. A pale boy on a lamed horse, coughing into his cloak. He's not supposed to cross the threshold, but rules bend when death rides faster than obedience. The abbot reads the letter silently. His lips tighten, his hands tremble. The Black Death has reached the southern coast. No one says it aloud. That would be unseemly. But fear arrives like incense faint at first, then suffocating. The monks pray harder, they fast longer, they whisper psalms in their sleep. Laurent notices things. The gardener no longer sings. The older monks stumble more often. Augustine the rat stops appearing. The air changes. It tastes of metal. It moves slower, as if morning has already arrived, waiting for the bodies to catch up. There is talk muted and rare of villages emptied overnight, of priests found dead at their altars, of carts rolling through the streets, piled high with those who will never need confession again. And yet, inside these walls, the bells still ring. Life continues, or something like it. The rule does not make room for pestilence. It simply folds the plague into its rhythm like another fast, another trial. Laurent doesn't leave the scriptorium. He copies psalms about wrath and mercy. He illuminates a manuscript with trembling hands, drawing gold halos around saints he can't remember believing in. He does not ask who is missing at dinner. He does not look too closely at the infirmary. Silence is easier now, not because of discipline, but because grief is quieter than obedience ever was. One morning, the bell does not ring. Laurent wakes anyway, out of habit, out of fear, out of the knowledge that no one else might. He walks to the chapel. The door is open. The abbot is not there. He kneels alone. Not in prayer, exactly, but in the shape of one, the only shape left when you don't know what else to become. And there, in the silence, he finally speaks. Just once. Just loud enough for the stone to remember. Are you still here? No one answers. But somewhere in the walls, something stirs. And for a moment, Laurent thinks he hears tiny footsteps in the rafters. There's a bell for everything. At sunrise, at mid-morning, at dusk. When to rise, when to pray, when to eat, when to sleep. The bells are the heartbeat of the monastery. Not loud, exactly, but constant. They do not ask, they instruct. They do not wait, they summon. And in a world where time is circular and days are nearly identical, the bell is how you know you're still alive. Laurent listens for it now with a different kind of attention. After the plague crept in, the bells changed. Some tolls are missing. Some ring longer, slower, like the weight behind the rope is heavier or lonelier. The cadence is off, just slightly enough to unsettle the rhythm the monks have clung to for decades. There used to be a monk named Brother Henry who rang the bell with perfect discipline, never early, never late. He used to say that the bell was God's whisper turned metal. Laurent once found that overly poetic. Now he finds it unbearably sad. Henry is gone, and the bell wavers. Laurent doesn't ask who rings it now. It might be him soon. The rule says nothing about who tolls the bell when everyone else is gone. Routine continues anyway. That's the cruel miracle of it. You wake, you wash, you pray, you eat, if there's food, you copy, if there's light, you sleep, if your dreams allow. And in between, you try not to think about which bed will be empty next. There is something unspeakably tender in this routine. It is not denial, it is devotion. Like washing the floor after the house has collapsed, or singing hymns into a crumbling wall. It is the refusal to surrender meaning, even when all the signs tell you there is none left. Laurent begins copying a new manuscript. It's a strange little text, half liturgical, half apocalyptic. The margins are filled with notes from some long-dead monk, written in a trembling hand. One reads, "Do not despair, though the stars fall." Laurent underlines it. Not for theology, for company. There are fewer voices now at meals. The silence has changed. Shape it's no longer chosen, it's inherited. Grief has taken a seat at the table, and no one dares ask it to leave. But still, the bell rings. Sometimes it's too loud, sometimes too soft. Sometimes it sounds like a cry for help, but it rings, and as long as it does, Laurent rises. He walks to the chapel. He bows where the abbot used to sit. He lights the candle. He chants the psalm. In the morning, Lord, you hear my voice. In the morning, I lay my requests before you and wait expectantly. The words catch in his throat, but the bell doesn't care if you believe them, only that you say them. The rule demands fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, but now most days are fasting days, not by design, just by circumstance. The kitchen is emptier. The cook brother Matthew, who used to hum tuneless songs while stirring thin soup, hasn't been seen in days. No one replaces him. Meals arrive late or not at all. The bread is staler. The portions smaller. Laurent barely notices. Hunger has become background noise, a low hum in the chest, like a forgotten bell that still rings somewhere deep inside the body. Fasting is supposed to bring clarity, discipline the flesh, make room for the divine. But when the body is weak, the spirit does not always grow stronger. Sometimes it just falters. He finds himself dizzy in the garden, bending to pull weeds and forgetting, for a moment, why he stood up. The sun doesn't help. It's thin and pale, like it too is fasting. And yet, Laurent does not complain, not because he is holy, but because there is no one left to complain to. Meals are taken in silence, as always, but now the benches creak less. The bowls remain untouched longer. He sits across from a seat that used to belong to Brother Arnaud, who once whispered jokes during Lent, who once gave Laurent his extra crust of bread without a word. Arnaud is gone. Laurent still hears his cough echoing in the cloister sometimes. The grief is quiet, but insistent. It sits with him through every mouthful. It steals his appetite, then scolds him for not finishing what little is offered. He chews anyway, slowly, mechanically, like prayer, like penance. Some of the older monks say the plague is a punishment, that the world has grown too proud, too loud, that the silence of the monastery is the only safe space left. But Laurent isn't sure. If this is judgment, it feels awfully indiscriminate. Saints and sinners rot alike. One evening, he finds a beetle in his bowl of lentils. He removes it gently, places it in the garden, and returns to eat the rest. He does not tell anyone. He simply writes in his journal that night, in a margin where no one will read, "The beetle lives." I suppose that's something. Fasting teaches you strange things. How to feel full on less. How to sit with discomfort. How to make peace with the constant companion of absence. But it does not make you divine. Laurent is still angry, still tired, still occasionally dreams of roast goose and laughter and the sound of a woman's voice, though he hasn't heard one in years. Still, when the bell rings, he rises. He chants the liturgy for the evening meal. He dips the bread in cold broth. He eats with trembling hands. And across from him, in the seat that should be Arnos, he imagines a presence, not a ghost, just a memory with good posture. And for a moment, he feels less alone. The scriptorium has become a mausoleum of movement. Most of the desks are empty now. The scratch of quills has quieted. The rhythm is broken. Only Laurent remains, hunched like a question mark over parchment that doesn't care if he finishes. The inkpot is half frozen again. The fire went out hours ago, and there's no one left to tend it. His breath curls visibly as he exhales, ghosting over the page like a forgotten spirit. The chill bites, but the work remains. Always, the work remains. Today, he copies a passage from a funeral sermons, something about the brevity of life, the sweetness of death for the righteous, the eternal silence of the tomb. The words feel heavier than usual, too familiar, too rehearsed. He dips his quill, presses it to the vellum, and writes, "We are born to die, and live only to prepare." He pauses, not because he disagrees, but because the phrase feels like a door he's entered too many times. A hallway with no windows. Just walls covered in prayers, and no one left to read them. Outside, a wind wails faintly through the stone. He imagines the world beyond fields abandoned, markets emptied, children who never made it to adulthood. In town, they burn the bodies now. There's no time for ritual, no one to toll the bell. And yet, here Laurent writes. He sharpens the quill against his knife. The blade is duller than it used to be, like everything. He stares at his hand calloused, trembling slightly, blue at the fingertips. He wonders how long he has, not in fear, not even in sadness. Just in the way one wonders how many candles remain before the wax runs out. He writes a little note in the margin just small enough to be missed. If you read this, I hope you are warm. A kindness for a stranger who may never come. But that's what most of his life has been, he realizes. Acts of faith for people he'll never meet. Words he'll never hear spoken. Names he'll never pronounce. Still, he writes, because the act itself is a kind of prayer, not to be answered necessarily, but to be witnessed. There is a holiness in the continuation, in the refusal to stop, even when no one's watching, even when the light fades, even when your fingers are too stiff to hold the pen. Laurent looks down at the manuscript. The ink has bled slightly. The letters waver. It's not perfect, but it is done. And in a world that has forgotten what it means to finish things with love, that perhaps is enough. The monastery was built to be impervious to noise, to vanity, to the chaos of markets and monarchs and the dying light of common lives. But it was never built for skies like this. The color has changed. What was once a pale gray has thickened into something heavier. A yellowish gloom, like spoiled parchment or bruised ivory. It doesn't move like real sky. It hangs, it waits. Laurent notices first during lauds. He glances through the high slit of a window and sees it the way the light bends wrong. How even the sun seems reluctant to rise fully into that strange color. There are no birds. There is no wind. It is, in every way, a sky that does not care if you notice it. Some of the monks say it's a sign. Others say it's ash from the town's burning dead. One, an old man who never speaks unless directly addressed, mutters that he saw this color once before during a lightning storm that killed half a village. No one replies. What is there to say? Laurent stares longer than he should. His eyes blur. The sky doesn't change. He goes back to work, but the air is wrong. It smells thick, like iron and smoke, and something older than death. His chest feels tight, not in panic, just pressure. Like the world is pressing down to see who cracks first. That evening, the garden is still. The herbs droop, wilted from neglect. No bees, no beetles. Even the rats seem subdued. Augustine hasn't returned in days. Laurent pretends not to notice, pretends that if he just follows the rule, the world will resume its pattern. That if he lights the candle and reads the psalm and eats his bread, the sky will remember how to be blue again. But something inside him curls slightly inward. A realization, maybe, that the world he knew is not just dying, it might already be gone. And the sky is not a witness, it is a burial shroud. He writes again that night, in the space between copied prayers. What color is the sky where you are? It's not addressed to anyone, and yet it feels too fragile to speak aloud. The ink doesn't dry properly. The air is too damp. The parchment wrinkles at the corners. And when he lays his head down to rest, he dreams of blank pages and a sky that bleeds. Still, at dawn, the bell rings, and he rises. Not because the sky turned blue, but because the rule says he must. There's a moment just before matins long, before sunrise, when the world holds its breath. Laurent is awake before the bell, not by choice. Sleep has become a nervous guest, knocking but never staying. The straw mattress itches. The cold has made a home in his joints. He no longer dreams of voices or food, just of walking through halls where everyone is missing. He wraps himself in his robe and moves through the cloister like a shadow in the shape of a man. The chapel is dark. He lights a single taper. The flame flickers, small and defiant. It throws shadows against the stone walls, crude imitations of saints who do not speak. The statues are cracked. The incense has run out. The holy water bowl is dry. Still, he kneels. The psalm is one he knows by heart. They all are now. But tonight, the words feel heavier, like he's trying to lift something that no longer wants to be held. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. The echo returns to him, but not convincingly. It's a lonely sound, a sound meant for a full choir, not one voice with chapped lips and frozen breath. He continues anyway, because the rule does not say, pray when it feels meaningful. It says, pray. Because prayer is not always for God. Sometimes it's a way to mark time, a way to say, I am still here. I have not stopped. Halfway through the psalm, Laurent falters. Not from doubt, from exhaustion. He sits, just for a moment. The candle gutters low. The shadows lean in. He thinks of the others, Brother Henry, Brother Arnaud, Brother Matthew. Their voices used to fill this chapel. They used to harmonize in the darker hours, like stars singing in formation. Now there is only silence between syllables. And yet, he begins again. Out of the depths. It doesn't matter that no one hears. It doesn't matter that the chapel is empty, the air unmoved, the candle nearly gone. He says it because saying it is the last thread he has. Because this chapel is not just a place of worship, is a record, a witness to those who stayed behind, who sang when their throats ached, who fasted with grief in their bellies, who knelt even when their knees screamed. Laurent finishes the psalm. He doesn't rise right away. Instead, he stays on the cold stone floor, not waiting, just being. The silence wraps around him, not like punishment, but like a blanket that's too thin, too warm, but too familiar to give up. And for a moment, a flicker only, he thinks he hears footsteps in the corridor behind him. Not rats, not ghosts, a presence. He does not turn. He simply blows out the candle and waits for the next bell. Every monastery has a door no one talks about. Not a grand gate, not a chapel threshold. A side door, quiet, unspectacular, often stuck or swollen from the rain. But it's there, and it's never locked. Laurent passes it sometimes on his way to gather water. It leads out through the garden wall, onto a narrow path that winds down into the valley toward the villages, toward the noise, toward the rest of the living world. He has never opened it, not because he couldn't, but because to open it would be to ask a question the rule does not answer. What if you left? He first wonders it during Lent. The fasting is harsher this year. The death toll has risen. The ink supply is low. The garden is frostbitten. The remaining monks avoid each other, not from discipline, but from a thin veil of fear. Who coughed? Who touched the basin? Who will die next? Laurent hasn't seen his reflection in weeks. When he passes the water barrel and glimpses the surface, he startles. He looks hollowed, not older, exactly, just less. Like someone erased his edges and forgot to redraw them. And so, the door begins to call to him, not loudly, just persistently. He dreams of it sometimes. In the dream, it opens not to the world, but to silence deeper than even the chapel knows. Sometimes the door is locked. Sometimes it opens to fire. Sometimes it opens to nothing at all. But always, he wakes with his hand reaching for something that isn't there. He thinks of the world beyond, of the town if it still stands, of bread sold with silver coins, of women with uncovered hair, of music with rhythm, of illness, yes, but also of choice. The rule does not permit departure without permission, but there is no one left to ask. One evening, after copying a passage on perseverance, he sets down the quill. His fingers are blue. His eyes burn. The candle is low. He rises, walks the corridor, passes the dormitory, passes the chapel, reaches the door. It has no handle, just a heavy wooden slab, dark with years, marked by weather and the occasional rat scratch. He places his hand against it. The wood is cold. He waits. Nothing happens. No voice, no revelation, no bolt of divine approval or celestial guilt. Just the door, just the monk. He does not open it, not tonight. Instead, he turns away, slowly, as if afraid to wake something that sleeps behind it. Because staying is also a choice, even when it feels like surrender. Laurent has not received a letter in over a decade. This is not unusual. Letters are rare in monastic life, more sacred than personal, more obligation than intimacy. News from the outside arrives in brief Latin lines: donation, disaster, then silence again. But tonight, with the moon low and the ink pot nearly dry, Laurent begins to write one. There is no intended recipient. He addresses it simply to the world should it return. The parchment is thin, the handwriting careful. He writes slowly, like he's rediscovering the language of conversation. The quill scratches in the quiet. A lone mouse, smaller than Augustine, more skittish scurries past without pause. He writes, "If you find this, then perhaps we were not entirely lost. There's no poetry in it, no great theological insight, just the plain, aching voice of someone who's been quiet too long. My name is not important. I was a monk. I copied things. I prayed, sometimes poorly. I fasted. I lit candles. I fed a rat once. His name was Augustine. I think he died before I did." He hesitates, then continues. "The others are gone now. Some to God, some to fever, some just gone. I ring the bell because the rule says I must. I sing psalms alone. I think the echo gets bored of me. The candle gutters. Wax runs like spilled time." He dips the quill again. "We built these walls to keep the world out. And now the world is gone. and we remain. I'm not sure what that says. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. He pauses again. The ink is thickening. The cold makes his joints slow. He finishes the letter. If you are out there, be kind. Remember us not as saints, but as people who stayed, who waited, who believed, even when it stopped feeling holy. We were here, that's all. No signature, no seal. He folds it once, neatly, and places it in a gap behind the old psalter on the shelf. Dust falls like snow as he slides the volume back. No one will find it, probably, but that's not the point. It's not about being found. It's about leaving something behind. A voice in the dark, a message in the silence, a monk who stayed when he almost didn't. The monastery's hearth hasn't been lit in days. It used to glow faintly, even in the leanest seasons, even when the rule frowned at comfort. A small concession to the living, enough warmth to prevent frostbite, enough light to keep the ink from freezing. But now the logs are gone. The ash is cold. Laurent stands in front of the hearth and stares. There is no firewood left. The stores were never large. Winter came early this year. The last of the wood went to the infirmary, where the sick no longer need it. Still, he kneels. Out of habit, out of defiance, out of something deeper that has no name. He places his hands above the unlit embers, pretending the heat, pretending the light, pretending that this ritual still means what it used to. He used to warm his hands here after copying. He used to feel the sting of returning circulation. He used to laugh quietly, guiltily when the fire popped and startled Brother Henry, who once joked that even hell must feel like relief compared to a January morning in the cloister. Now the hearth is silent. Laurent closes his eyes. He tries to remember the exact feeling of heat, not in general, not theoretically, but precisely how it moved through the skin, how it softened the joints, how it made the ink flow smoother. Memory is not always generous. Sometimes it gives you just enough to ache. The cold creeps up his arms, into his ribs, into his jaw. He presses his hands together in mock prayer, more for warmth than worship. And then, without thinking, he says aloud, "Come back to what he doesn't know. The fire, the warmth, the world, himself." There is no answer, only the hiss of wind between the stones. And yet, he lingers, because even an unlit hearth is a kind of hope, a symbol of what could be, a shrine to the possibility of warmth. It is, in its own quiet way, a refusal to give up on the idea that comfort once existed. He stands, his joints crack, his breath mists faintly in the gloom. He walks back toward the scriptorium, where the ink has begun to congeal and the candle waits to be relit. But before he leaves, he places one small twig gathered weeks ago from the garden wall into the hearth. It will not catch, it will not blaze, but it is a gesture, a prayer, a monk's rebellion against the cold. Some evenings, the songs betray him, not deliberately, not cruelly, just off. The melodies, once second nature, slip in the throat like a forgotten childhood language. Words tumble out in the wrong order. A psalm starts strong, then falters mid-verse. The silence that follows is heavier than failure. Laurent stands alone in the chapel. The acoustics were designed for choirs, not solo voices. His chant echoes too much. It feels like singing to a void that has grown teeth. He tries again. The first line of Psalm 102, "Hear my prayer, O Lord. Let my cry come to you." The sound is thin. His voice cracks. He hasn't spoken all day. He stops, not because he doesn't believe, but because tonight, belief feels like a coat that no longer fits. He sits on the stone bench near the altar. The candle beside him has tunneled into itself, the flame barely visible through a wall of wax. He doesn't bother fixing it. Outside, the wind picks up. It moans through the high windows like an animal that doesn't know it's dying. The sound is too alive for a place like this. Laurent covers his ears. He remembers suddenly a feast day from years ago, a rare celebration. The chapel was filled. Wine, laughter, color-scarlet cloth on the altar, music that didn't sound like mourning. Brother Matthew played the psaltery. Brother Henry sang too loudly. Brother Arnaud Danstius actually danced for one scandalous moment before bowing deeply in mock apology. Laurent laughed. He hasn't since. The memory doesn't bring comfort. It stings, like warmth remembered too long after frostbite. And yet, tonight, with no one to hear him, he begins to hum. Not the right psalm, not even a chant, just a fragment of that feast days him. A crooked melody, a defiant noise, something living. His voice is rusty, off-key, but it's his. He doesn't know the words. Just the rhythm, just the shape, just enough to remember he has a voice at all. The chapel listens. The silence holds him not in judgment, but in tired companionship. It says nothing, but it does not stop him. When he finishes, he bows his head, not out of shame, out of gratitude, because tonight the rule was wrong. Tonight the mistake was the prayer, and for once it felt heard. Laurent finds it folded neatly on the bench outside the dormitory. A robe, simple, brown, worn at the edges. One of theirs, one of his, but no one is near it. No name, no note, just the weight of cloth holding the shape of someone who isn't coming back. He doesn't need to ask whose it was. The monastery doesn't lose many things. What it loses, it absorbs. Grief here is not loud. It does not weep. It sets things down gently and lets time cover them like dust. Laurent picks it up. The fabric is still warm. He presses it to his face, not dramatically, not to cry, just to remember what warmth once felt like when it came from another person, not fire or fever. He carries the robe to the laundry basin, not out of duty, out of reverence. In monastic life, you wash the dead man's robe, you fold it, you do not speak about it. You place it in the storage chest with the others, and you wait for the next novice who may never come. The basin water is cloudy, cold. A few flecks of soap remain from last week's washing. He soaks the robe carefully, as if it might bruise. His fingers numb quickly. He scrubs anyway. As he works, he thinks of the brother who wore it. Not his faults, not his holiness, just his presence. How he once snored during matins. How he once spilled lentils and muttered a curse that made Laurent snort with laughter. How he once sat beside Laurent in the garden and said, simply, "It's not so bad, is it?" He hadn't answered. Now he wishes he had. The water turns grey. Laurent rinses. Wringing out the robe, he notices a stitch on the hemcrude, unmistakably done by hand. A repair, likely done in haste. Perhaps during a fever. It feels more sacred than any relic. He hangs the robe to dry in the corridor, where the wind always finds its way in. It will be stiff by morning, but it will be clean. He lights a candle and places it below the window. Not a vigil, not a ritual, just light. Just something to push back against the night. And when he passes the robe again, just before sleep, he runs a hand across the cloth and whispers, not a prayer, not really, Thank you for staying as long as you did. He doesn't wait for a reply. In monasteries, silence is the loudest answer. It did not arrive like a storm. There was no scream, no fire, no thunder of hooves or crashing gates, no apocalypse made for paintings, just a cough, a fever, a silence slightly heavier than the one before it. The plague in the monastery was not theatrical. It was slow, patient. It moved not in shouts, but in shared spoons and whispered psalms, and the quiet act of passing the same cup from one cracked mouth to another. At first, Laurent thought they might be spared. The gates were closed. The monks were quiet. They touched nothing unnecessary. They followed the rule like it might shield them, but the rule was made for the soul, not the body, and bodies are much harder to discipline. Brother Etienne was the first to fall, not the youngest, not the oldest, just the one who still believed that rosemary in the bath could ward off sickness. His bed stayed empty at Vespers. No one asked. They simply bowed their heads and added another name to the unspoken tally. Then Brother Gerald, then the cook, then a novice whose name Laurent hadn't yet learned, each gone with the same dry fever, the same trembling hands, the same final silence. There were no graveyards large enough nearby, no rites with incense or hymns. They buried them under the frost-hardened soil of the orchard. No markers, just small mounds and the smell of turned earth. Laurent helped dig one of them. His hands blistered. The spade was too dull, the ground too cold, the silence too much. He did not speak during the burial, not even to himself. But that night he wrote a line in the margin of an unfinished manuscript. We plant seeds of absence and call it devotion. The ink bled. The page wrinkled. The abbot tried to comfort them once. He gave a short speech about endurance, about grace in suffering, about the book of Job. But when he coughed at the end, no one met his eyes. He died 4 days later. No one replaced him. No vote was taken. No chain of command followed. There were not enough hands left for formality. Leadership, like everything else, simply evaporated. And still the bell rang. Fewer times, with less precision. But it rang because someone had to mark the hours. Someone had to remind the stones that time was still moving, and that among the living, one monk still knew how. When it comes gently. Laurent does not wake screaming. He does not convulse. There's no blood, no drama. Just a strange warmth behind the eyes, a heaviness in the knees, a reluctance in the bones to rise for matins. He assumes it's the cold, or the fasting, or age, though he isn't really old by any measure beyond monastic time. But by midday, the ink on the parchment swims. His breath catches. His hands tremble, not from the chill but from something deeper, something coming loose. He does not tell anyone. There is hardly anyone left to tell. Instead, he returns to his cell, not to rest, to prepare. There is no medicine, no physician. The infirmary is a pile of folded habits and prayers that went unanswered. So he does what monks do. He writes. He begins copying Psalm 88. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like one without strength. The words blur. He blinks, keeps going. He wants his final act to be faithful, not in belief, in structure, in rhythm, in the poetry of doing what one is meant to do, even when it makes no difference. He drinks water, forces a few bites of dry bread, kneels by the candle, lights it. When the fever comes fully, it arrives like a fog, not cruel, just insistent. He forgets lines, forgets the order of hours, forgets the names of brothers who have only recently died. He wakes at odd times, sweats through his robe, sees visions, not heavenly, just odd. Once he sees Augustine, the rat, in the chapel, sitting on the abbot's chair, solemn and watchful. Once he sees a procession of monks walking through the cloister, all faceless, each humming a different key. Once he hears the bell ringing underwater. He smiles at that one, because of course, even dying, the bell would find him. There is no panic in the fever, only waiting, and in the waiting he does not pray for healing. That would be indulgent. He prays for clarity, for a moment, just one, when everything lines up again. The rule, the rhythm, the reason. He thinks he gets it, briefly, but then it slips, and he's left only with a half-copied psalm and the taste of ink on his tongue. There is a corner of the dormitory reserved for the sick. No curtains, no ointments, just straw and shadow and the knowledge that if you're sent there, you're probably not coming back. Laurent doesn't walk there. He drifts. Fever heavy, his feet uncertain. The hallway feels longer than it did yesterday. Or perhaps it is Laurent who has grown slower, stretched out by pain and time like wax, left too near a flame. He lies down on the straw. It crackles beneath him. The sound is oddly comforting, something real, something present. The mattress accepts him without judgment. It knows what to do. He stares at the ceiling. It stares back. And then the visions come. Not dreams. Not quite. More like thoughts dressed in costumes. They slip between memory and invention, neither invited nor banished. He sees the chapel on fire, but the flames sing psalms. He sees a young boy in the scriptorium, copying a single word over and over. Mercy, mercy, mercy. He sees himself at the door without a handle. This time it opens, and behind it only snow. The visions are not terrifying. They're tender, exhausted. They arrive with the same quiet insistence as the rule itself. This, then this, then this. He mouths the psalms. He's not sure if the words are correct. He's not sure if he's speaking aloud. But in the haze, the rhythm matters more than the content. The pulse of repetition, the drumbeat of old words. He wonders absurdly if anyone will wash his robe, if anyone will light a candle, if anyone will copy his margin notes and wonder about the man who wrote, "If you are cold, I understand." The straw smells of old sweat and sanctity. He breathes it in. He exhales slowly. His body aches in strange places. His vision swims, but the fear, oddly, is absent. Not because he's brave, because he's tired. And that, in its own quiet way, is a kind of peace. It burns lower now. The candle beside Laurent's cot, one of the last ones, flickers with less certainty each hour. It was lit by Brother Matthew before he disappeared into fever. No one extinguished it. No one dared. It has become a vigil by accident. Laurent watches it between waking and sleeping, between one psalm and the next. Its flame dances slowly, deliberately, like a monk walking through evening prayers. It does not hurry, it does not fear. He speaks to it sometimes, not in madness, in companionship. "You've stayed longer than most," he says once. His voice is a rasp, a parchment whisper. The candle says nothing, but its light grows warm for a moment, like it understands. Laurent remembers other candles, feast day candles in brass holders, the wax running like joy down their sides. Candles for saints, candles for rain, candles for repentance, lined up in rows like little towers of apology. And he remembers one candle, just one, on the night he nearly left. The flame had flickered toward the door without a handle, illuminating the path out. He'd followed it part way, then stopped. He's glad now that he stopped, not because he survived, but because staying has become its own story. He watches the flame. It bends, steadies, leans back, a rhythm of its own. In the hallway, he hears something, a step, a breath, the sound of silence rearranging itself. He does not turn. He speaks again, barely above the breath. If you come, come gently. He doesn't know who he's addressing. God, maybe, or death, or that final quiet the Psalms warned about, but never quite explained. The candle flickers, then steadies. Laurent closes his eyes, and the flame stays. By morning, the candle is gone, melted to a stump, its wick curled like a sleeping child. The wax has run in rivulets across the wooden stand, pooling in quiet swirls, fossilizing the hours it held vigil. Laurent wakes to the absence. Not of light sunrise has begun to leak through the narrow windows, but of presence. The candle had become more than a source of flame. It was a companion, a listener, a final witness to the old rhythm. He reaches for the wax. It's cool now, solid. He runs a fingertip through one of the puddles, tracing the curve of its edge like a monk reciting a familiar prayer. He considers carving something into it, a name, a word, a mark. But what would he write? Not his name. That would be too loud, too vain. Instead, he takes a sliver of coal from the ashes of last week's fire long dead, but not forgotten, and scratches a single word into the wax. Stayed. Not saved, not holy, not gone, just stayed. Because that, in the end, is all he's done. He did not flee, he did not rage, he did not shine. He stayed, through the cold, through the hunger, through the psalms that echoed to no one, and the prayers that turned to vapor, and the fever that burned without apology. He stayed, in the silence, in the work, in the dust. He sets the candle base beside the psalter, tucks it gently near the letter he wrote to no one. It sits there like a relic of a world not yet gone, not quite. And then, with no ceremony, he stands. His legs shake, his breath is shallow, but the bell will ring soon. Or maybe it won't. Maybe it's his turn again. Either way, the hour needs marking, and someone must be there to hear it. The rule was written for community. It speaks of shared labor, of mutual correction, of obedience to an abbot whose presence binds the daily rhythm. It outlines when to eat, when to sleep, when to be silent, not for the individual's sake, but for the whole. But what happens when the community is gone? What happens when you are the only one left to obey? Laurent doesn't know if he is the last. He suspects there might be one or two others still somewhere in the monastery, clinging to corners, avoiding the halls, coughing into cloth. But he hasn't seen a face in days. The meals are not prepared. The bells ring irregularly, if at all. The garden is untouched. And yet he follows the rule, not perfectly, not joyfully, not even with certainty. But he follows. He wakes before dawn. He shuffles into the chapel. He chants alone, skipping the parts meant for the choir. He bows where no one watches. He kneels on stone, smoothed by 100 knees that will never bend again. Why? Not out of fear, not out of faith, exactly. Out of something older, the need for shape, the need for time to mean something. In a world unraveling, rhythm becomes the last form of resistance. He copies a passage from the Gospel of John, though the ink is running low. He whispers the lines as he writes them, not because he believes each word, but because they deserve not to die in silence. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. He pauses. The candle flickers. He doesn't know if it's true, but he writes it anyway, because that is what the rule has always been. Not a set of beliefs, but a choreography of devotion. A way of walking through emptiness with dignity. Later, he sweeps the cloister walk. No one will notice. No one will praise him. But the dust bothers him. And the rule says to maintain cleanliness, even in the face of decay. So he sweeps, and when he finds a broken bowl in the refectory, he picks it up. He doesn't mend it, just holds it, sits with it, and thinks. This is what it means to stay, to hold the broken thing, to name it sacred, to not look away. There's a sound that's been haunting the cloister. Not voices, not footsteps, not rats, a whisper, not from a throat, but from the walls themselves. Stone remembering how to listen, air straining to become breath again. Laurent notices it during sext, the midday prayer, usually the warmest part of the day, though warmth no longer visits often. The chapel is cold, the air is still, and yet the sound persists. At first, he thinks it's tinnitus, a trick of solitude, a brain echoing itself. But then he realizes it's the Psalms, not as he chants them, but as they used to be. He hears harmonies that aren't there, breaths taken in unison, that strange, intimate music of many voices speaking the same words at the same moment, like time remembering itself. He stops, mid-verse, listens. Nothing, just the absence. But that's the thing about obedience. It leaves traces. You say the same words in the same place for 30 years, and the stones begin to memorize them. The dust develops cadence. Even silence learns the liturgy. Laurent smiles, faintly. It's not joy, it's recognition. He kneels, not out of obligation, but out of longing, and begins again. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He doesn't expect an answer, but part of him hopes that somewhere, deep in the marrow of the monastery, the words are still living, still traveling, still finding ears that need them, not God's, maybe, but someone's. He remembers when Brother Henry said, half laughing, "We don't pray to be heard. We pray so we remember how to speak." At the time, Laurent had rolled his eyes. Now he understands. Because the rule is not just about God. It's about not letting the voice die. About not letting your tongue forget what meaning feels like. About keeping rhythm when melody is gone. He finishes the psalm. The echo lingers, then fades. But for a moment, just a moment, it felt like they were all still there. There used to be a sundial in the garden. Cracked now, moss-covered, forgotten by everyone except Laurent. It once marked the hours as faithfully as the bell. Carved with Roman numerals, its gnomon long since rusted, it stood as proof that even the sun could be tamed into obedience. Now it casts no shadow. The sky is too thick, the light too diffused. Time, once so meticulously measured, now drips uncounted into the stone. Laurent visits the sundial anyway, not to check the hour. He knows the bell won't ring today. He knows the rule will not reprimand him, but he kneels beside it, brushing off the moss with cold fingers. The stone beneath is colder still. He traces the numbers like a child learning to count. 2, 3. The numbers feel like ghosts. He whispers them, gently. There's no one to hear, but that doesn't matter. He's not counting time, he's honoring it. There's something about the cloister that makes time behave differently. Hours repeat themselves. Days collapse into prayers. Years fold inward like parchment tucked into a binding. But here, by the sundial, Laurent remembers, once Every hour mattered. Once he rang the bell with joy. Once he waited for noon with anticipation, for meals, for sunlight, for a moment when silence gave way to something more human. Now he doesn't wait, he endures. The sundial tells no time today, but Laurent sits beside it as though it still does. He recites terse the mid-morning prayer, though it's likely past midday. He lets the words fall, not by the clock, but by the breath. Not because he has to, but because the rhythm has become part of his bones. He wonders, distantly, if time is still passing at all, or if the monastery has slipped into some space between ticks of purgatory of routine without reason. He touches the sundial one last time. "Teach us to number our days," he whispers, quoting Psalm 90, "that we may gain a heart of wisdom." The wind stirs, and for a moment the sun pushes through, just enough for the shadow to move. Just a little, but it's enough. The monastery garden was never lush. It grew what it could: onions, leeks, cabbage, herbs for illness, bitter greens for fasting days. Nothing ornamental, nothing unnecessary. Beauty was not the point. Now it barely grows at all. Laurent walks its narrow rows with a slow, careful gait. The soil is hard. The last frost came early and stayed late. Weeds thrive where roots do not. The rosemary is brittle. The turnips are hollowed out by unseen teeth. Still, he tends it, because the rule says he must. Because even when the earth forgets how to give, he must remember how to ask. He pulls the weeds gently, not in anger, not even in hope, just to make space for something, for air, for the memory of growth. His fingers are caked with dirt, his nails blackened. The hem of his robe drags through mud that smells faintly of decay and lavender. The garden is where Brother Arnaud used to sing under his breath, where Brother Gerald once tripped and blamed the devil for the root he never saw, where laughter once interrupted the rhythm of work, scandalous and brief. Now the only sound is the scratching of tools, the occasional flap of a crow's wing overhead, the sigh of soil as it accepts another useless seed. Laurent plants anyway. He doesn't bless the rows, he doesn't expect harvest, but he presses each seed into the ground like a prayer he no longer needs answered. One of the beds has gone completely to wild mint. It's overgrown, invasive, untamable. He leaves it, because sometimes, even now, he likes to run his hand through it and come away smelling like memory. The sun starts to set. He gathers what little he can to leeks, a handful of sorrel, a sprig of thyme, not enough for supper, but enough to prove the world is still trying. He looks back at the garden before heading in. It doesn't look like much. It never did. But it is the only place in the monastery still alive by its own choosing, that is sacred, too. Evening falls like a closing book, not abruptly, not in darkness, just in slow, fading pages of light, as the chapel windows surrender the last of the sun. The shadows stretch, the dust floats, the quiet deepens, not from absence, but from fullness. Laurent sits in the scriptorium. He hasn't written all day. The parchment is blank, the ink congealed at the edges. His quill rests beside his hand, untouched. There is no specific psalm to copy, no edict, no one left to assign the task. And yet he sits, because the rule does not demand product, it demands presence, so he gives it. He watches the flickering candle. He listens to the creak of beams in the ceiling above. He lets the silence settle like a second robe across his shoulders. For years, silence was regulation. Now it is revelation. It's not empty anymore. It's crowded with ghosts, with memories, with the weight of every moment that went unspoken. He dips the quill absent-mindedly, gently into the ink. The tip scratches the parchment. Not a psalm, not a sermon, just a sentence, a small one, almost not worth writing. I am still here. He doesn't know why he writes it. There is no audience, no archivist waiting, no bishop flipping through the margins of a forgotten monk's notes to find something quote-worthy. But still he writes it, because the act itself is holy. To mark the silence, to give it shape, to say, not with pride, but with quiet astonishment, I stayed. He sets the quill down, the candle gutters, and in that final hush, before Compline, the last prayer of the day, Laurent does not chant, he listens, not for God, for the silence itself. And in that silence, he hears a truth. The rule is not a cage, it's a companion, one that stayed when no one else did. The last prayer of the day is called Compline. It is meant to close the evening with peace, to wash the soul clean, to bless the silence of sleep with the promise that one has done enough, prayed enough, repented enough. It begins with the words, "Grant us a peaceful night and a perfect end." Tonight, Laurent says them alone. He kneels in the chapel, as always. The candle beside him is shorter now, clinging to its last few hours. The wax is spilled over in odd shapes, like frozen waves. The stone beneath his knees has grown familiar, like the touch of an old friend. There is no choir, no abbot, no voices to harmonize with his chant, just echoes. He begins. The chant is soft, fragile, almost embarrassed by its own persistence. It flutters through the chapel like a bird that has forgotten it was ever meant to fly. He sings the antiphon. He speaks the psalm. And when he reaches the closing lines, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," his voice shakes, not from doubt, from memory. He remembers the first time he said those words. A trembling novice, not yet sure of his robes or his place. How they sounded back then, like armor, like protection, like a whispered pact with something larger than himself. Now they sound different, not a plea, not a shield, just an offering, a recognition that sometimes the perfect end never comes. Only the continuation, only the next hour, the next breath, the next candle. Laurent finishes the prayer, he bows, and then nothing. No final bell, no dismissive nod from the abbot, no shuffle of sandals across the stone, just a stillness so complete it feels almost animate, like the chapel itself has bowed its head in return. He sits for a while, not waiting, just being. The stars are out, though he can't see them. The sky has cleared since yesterday. Somewhere beyond the thick stone, the universe continues, cold and vast and unconcerned. He does not pray again. He does not sleep yet. He simply stays in the chapel, eyes closed, letting the silence settle around him like snow. And in that hush, he whispers one final sentence, not to God, not to history, not to the rule, just to the room. I will be here tomorrow. Morning comes without ceremony, no bell, no footsteps, no rustle of robes in the dormitory. The sky turns pale, then pale again. There is no sun, not really, just the suggestion of light, as if someone behind the clouds considered beginning the day, then changed their mind. Laurent wakes anyway, not from habit, exactly, from a kind of internal momentum. The rule has become part of his breath cycle. Even without bells, his body knows. He sits up slowly. The straw mattress clings to him. His back aches in places it didn't yesterday. He coughs, once dry, sharpened waits. It passes. For now, there is no movement in the halls. No one has lit the candles in the chapel. No breakfast will be served. The kitchen is silent. The fire is long since dead. Still he dresses. Still he washes. Still he walks to the chapel. There's a quiet dread to this kind of mourning. Not fear, not panic. Just the suffocating knowledge that this might be all there is from now on. Not death, but absence. A world that continues, but emptier each time. He begins prime alone. The first prayer of the day. His voice is barely there. Just enough to count. Just enough to be recorded. If not by ink, then by breath. Open my lips, O Lord, and my mouth shall proclaim your praise. He fumbles the next verse. It doesn't matter. No one corrects him. No one hears. And still he continues. Because the rule does not require witnesses. It only requires the doing. After prayers, he walks to the refectory. He opens the bread chest. Empty, of course. He pours water from the pitcher. Stale, he drinks it anyway. The garden is quiet. The mint has grown wilder still. The leeks have turned soft. The rosemary clings on. He pulls one stalk, holds it to his nose. The scent is faint, but there, he laughs. Once, a single breath of disbelief. Because somehow, in all this, despite rot, despite plague, despite solitude, and frost and silence, the rosemary remembers. Laurent places the sprig beside the psalter, not as an offering, as a reminder that something still begins, even when the day does not. The scriptorium smells like dust and abandonment, not freshly abandoned, long abandoned, the kind of stillness that feels fossilized, like even the air has given up trying to move. Laurent enters with care, as though his footsteps might wake something that prefers to sleep. The desks are untouched. Scrolls remain half-opened. Inkpots dried to husks. Quills snapped or curled like old claws. The manuscripts lie where they were left, mid-sentence, mid-line, mid... He recognizes some of the pages. He copied them. Others belonged to monks now buried under the orchard. One page in particular draws his attention. Not because of the text, because of the pause. It ends on a word knot, a period, not an amen, just an unfinished phrase. The final letter leans forward, waiting for its partner. The ink trails off like a breath interrupted. Laurent knows the rule. Finish what was started. But he doesn't. He sits instead, not to copy, to read. To hold the silence beside the unfinished sentence and listen for what it might have been. The text is from Isaiah. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of thee, and then nothing. The pen dropped, the hand failed, or the monk simply knew. Some words are best left incomplete. Laurent rests his hand beside the parchment. He does not write the ending. He could, but that would make it his. Instead, he adds a line in the margin. He knew what came next. That is enough. He does not sign it. No one does anymore. The candle burns low. A sliver of light slides across the desk from the high window slit. Dust dances in it, not quickly, just enough to remind him that air still moves, that time still breathes. He closes the manuscript gently, not like a task completed, like a friend being tucked in. There will be no more copying today. The rule does not say what to do when the work ends. But Laurent, somehow, still knows. You sit, you wait. You light the next candle, even if you don't write a thing. The bell tower is colder than the rest of the monastery. It always has been. Wind snakes through its narrow slits. The stairs are uneven, worn smooth by centuries of feet now gone. The rope hangs from the ceiling like a relic of a forgotten commandment. Laurent hasn't wrung it in days, not for lack of will, for lack of reason. But tonight, as the sky turns the color of old ink, he climbs the steps, not quickly, not with purpose, just steadily, like someone walking toward the last verse of a long, unfinished hymn. The bell rope is stiff, frayed at the bottom. He touches it like it might break, like it might turn to ash in his hands. But it holds. It always holds. He doesn't ring it immediately. Instead, he stands in the tower and looks out. The land is quiet. The hills beyond the walls blur into dusk. The town, if it still breathes, is invisible in the dark. Smoke rises from no chimneys. Roads are empty. Even the birds have stopped asking questions. He pulls the rope. Once. The bell answers. A low, aching sound. It doesn't cry out. It hums. A voice shaped by metal and memory. A vibration that says, "I am still here." He pulls again. The sound is steadier this time. The air beneath it trembles. It rolls out over the cloister, over the fields, over the graves tucked beneath the orchard. It rings for no reason, and for every reason, not to summon, not to warn, but to remember. He rings it 7 times, not because the rule says so, but because that's how many monks are buried without names, because 7 is a holy number, because sometimes you ring the bell not for the living or the dead, but for yourself, to prove you still can. He lets go of the rope. It sways gently. He doesn't wait for silence. He begins descending while the last chime is still breathing its way into the sky. At the bottom of the tower, he looks up once more. The rope still swings, like a heartbeat, like the last line of a song. Laurent has begun leaving pages blank, not out of laziness, not out of surrender, but because the words now feel less important than the space between them. There's something sacred in emptiness, not absence, not erasure, just room, room for someone else, perhaps, for another hand, another voice, another life to pick up the thread. Or maybe not. Maybe the blank page is the message. A gesture of quiet permission to let silence speak for once. He stacks the unfinished parchments in the scriptorium, ties them with a fraying ribbon of old linen. He doesn't label them, doesn't annotate, just places them neatly beside the completed texts. Like equus, he walks the cloister once more, touches the chapel door, nods toward the sundial, though it casts no shadow now, checks the garden where the mint has overrun the rosemary. All of it is quiet, but not dead. That word no longer fits. The monastery hasn't died. It has changed shape. He returns to his cell. It is small, spare, familiar as breath. On the wall hangs a single wooden cross, its edges worn down by time and fingertips. He reaches out, not to pray, not to plead, just to feel the grain of something that stayed with him. He lies down on the straw, pulls the robe tighter round his shoulders. There is no expectation tonight, no vigil, no echo, no final line, just the slow, rhythmic surrender to rest. Outside, the wind moves like a page turning. Somewhere in the rafters, a small sound, maybe a rat, maybe memory, maybe the world reminding him, you were here, and the rule. It waits, not for him, just for whoever needs it next. Time does not keep records kindly. Names fade, ink dissolves, buildings crumble, even holy ones. What was once sacred becomes scenery. What was once daily life becomes trivia. The monastery still stands, but only just. Centuries have passed. The bell has fallen from its tower, cracked clean through. The chapel roof collapsed in a storm no one remembers. The garden became overrun with ivy and silence. The cloister walk is moss-covered, its arches broken like ribs around a hollow heart. No pilgrims come, no prayers echo. No one remembers the rule, and yet, if you visit on a certain kind of day, when the fog clings close and the air feels old, you might feel something. Not a presence, not a ghost, just a rhythm, a sense that the stones once listened, that they held breath and psalm and hesitation, that someone stood where you now stand and thought not of history, but of survival, of obedience, of ink and frost and fire that never quite caught. There is no plaque here, no museum, no guided tours. The map calls it ruins, but the wind knows better. It still moves differently through the chapel, still curls through the scriptorium in long, slow turns, as if looking for a page that was never written. Still hushes as it nears the old bell rope, frayed and buried, yet waiting. Somewhere beneath the moss lies a page, unfinished, untouched, still holding the faint trace of a hand that once stayed, a name never recorded, a story never told, a life that obeyed the rule long after the rule stopped watching. Because faith, in the end, is not about what is seen. It's about what is done when no one will ever know. One day many years after Laurent was forgotten, traveller finds the monastery, not seeking it, just wandering. The path is overgrown. The gate has rusted shut, but the walls still stand, stubborn and crooked like old teeth. She steps inside. She is not a pilgrim. She is not a believer. She doesn't speak Latin, but something draws her in. The silence, perhaps. The feeling that this place once mattered, even if no one told her why. It's raining, softly, insistently. The kind of rain that feels like memory turned liquid. She finds the scriptorium. It's barely a room, now 3 walls and a roof beam leaning like a tired monk. But inside, the stone shelves are still there, cracked, empty, except for one bundle. Tied with linen, stiff with age, she lifts it. Pages, blank, mostly, but not all. Some hold fragments, lines, scribbles, margins filled with half-thoughts, and quiet jokes and psalms broken off before they finish. One says, "If you are cold, I understand." Another, "He knew what came next." That is enough. She does not understand them, not completely, but she understands enough that someone was here, that someone stayed. She tucks the pages into her coat, not to preserve them, just to carry them a little farther. Outside, the rain deepens. She stands where the bell once hung, imagines the sound, hears it, almost, a low hum in her bones, a noise made not for attention, but for time, for order, for no one at all. Before she leaves, she writes something, on a clean scrap of paper. Just a note, just a name, not hers. Lorenz. She places it under the old sundial. The ink begins to bleed as the rain soaks in. But for a moment, just a moment, it holds. Long after the last monk was buried and the last psalm fell silent, the rule remained. Not as text, not as doctrine, as rhythm, as a whisper in the habits of the place. Travelers who pass by speak of the stillness. They say time behaves differently near the ruins, that watches slow, that voices sound louder, that dreams, when dreamt beside the broken chapel, arrive in languages no one remembers learning. Some leave offerings, not candles or crosses, pebbles, bits of bread, scraps of cloth, as if some part of them, ancient and forgotten, still knows how to honor endurance. Once, a child visiting with her parents finds an old bell clapper in the grass. She picks it up, doesn't know what it is, but she carries it with reverence, as if it holds a secret, as if it remembers ringing. In town, the ruins are a curiosity, an oddity, a question mark in stone. Historians guess. Locals shrugged. A few dusty books mention a monastery. Fewer mention the plague. None mention Laurent, but the wind remembers him. It moves through the cloister with the same cadence he once walked. It wraps around the garden where the mint still grows wild. It runs its fingers through the rafters where rats once lived and prayers once rose. It lifts the corners of an old page left open beneath a fallen beam. The rule is gone, but its shape remains, in the way people still pause at the chapel's threshold, in the hush that follows the rain, in the rhythm of a day structured not by purpose, but by presence. Because not all memory needs a monument. Some just need silence to settle into and be left there. Centuries wear down everything. Stone softens, iron rusts, stories fade, but sometimes Dink survives. Tucked between layers of brittle parchment in a forgotten archive, someone finds a manuscript. It isn't catalogued, it isn't gilded or beautifully illuminated. It doesn't bear the crest of a monastery or the mark of a known scribe, but it is neat, careful, obsessively so, each letter exact, each line measured. The margins hold more than decoration, they hold breath, pause, personality, small notations that speak not to scholarship but to survival. One margin reads, "The sky was yellow today." Another, "This page was hard to write." No date, no name, but the handwriting shifts tighter in the winter, looser when the parchment is rough, a living hand in conversation with death. Scholars debate it. Is it a devotional, a journal, a collection of notes? Why so many psalms? Why so few conclusions? Why so many blank pages? One suggests it's a fragment from a monastic retreat. Another insists it's a copyist's private practice. A third says quietly, "It feels like a man trying not to disappear." No one argues with that. The manuscript is stored, digitized, translated. The notations fascinate, confuse, disappear into academic papers no one reads. But one reader, just one, carries the scanned pages home. She reads them by candlelight. She copies one line onto her wall. "I am still here." She doesn't know who wrote it, but she knows what it means. That someone alone, forgotten, quiet sat in a cold room and wrote not to be remembered, but simply to mark the fact of his presence. To leave behind something softer than a monument. Ink, and the way it lingers. No one knows who rebuilt the chapel wall. It wasn't part of any restoration. No government grant, no preservation society. Just a quiet repair. One section of fallen stone, lifted, reset, mortared without inscription. A mystery of labor with no name behind it. Locals say it was an old man who came every morning with a cart and left before dusk. Others say it was a woman with a notebook and too much grief. A few insist it was always that way, that the wall rebuilt itself. Of course, that's nonsense, but it's the kind of nonsense that feels true. What is true is this. One evening, in the quiet hour when dusk forgets itself, a sound was heard, not loud, not sharp, just a low hum. A bell only once, only briefly. There is no bell in the tower anymore. Not since it cracked and fell and was carried off for scrap or sanctity, but still the sound came. Some say it was the wind. Others say the stones finally sighed. One child said it was the earth remembering how to speak. And one old woman who walked the cloister every year on the same date, though no one asked why, said, very softly, "It's just the monk." No one asked which. No one needed to, because some part of the world still remembers what sound means, even when no one makes it. Still remembers the rhythm of those who stayed. Still hears the rule, not as command, but as comfort. Still hears the bell, even when there is no bell to ring. Eventually, even belief becomes weathered, not broken, not lost, just worn. Like a stair stepped on so many times, it forgets its original shape. Laurent's psalms were never shouted. He never preached. He never converted anyone. Never raised a finger in holy war. Never scrawled fire and brimstone in the margins of gospels. His faith was quieter than that. Less a fire, more a coal. It warmed, it glowed, it asked nothing in return. But toward the end, even that coal cooled. Not in rebellion, in exhaustion. He still said the words, still bowed, still lit the candle. But the name at the center of all that prayer, God, Christ, Lord, began to feel distant, not absent, just silent. Laurent didn't hate him for that, didn't doubt, he simply adjusted. He stopped asking questions that never got answers. He stopped waiting for comfort that never arrived. And the Psalms, he read them anyway, because they were beautiful, because they said what he couldn't, because they understood grief better than any theology. There's a strange kind of faith that grows in silence, not belief in a being, but in the act, the practice, the refusal to stop singing, even when no one listens. Laurent once copied a line over and over until it bled through the page. "I will lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." He didn't believe it, not in the end, but he wrote it anyway. Because the writing was the worship. Because sometimes faith is not what you feel, it's what you do when you feel nothing at all. Over time, the monastery and its monks became one. Not metaphorically, literally. The walls were their ribs, the garden their stomach, the chapel their lungs expanding with every psalm, contracting with every silence. Laurent felt it most in winter, the way the stones exhaled cold, the way the floors groaned with every footfall, the way each draught seemed to know its path better than the monks did. It was not a building, not entirely. It was a creature, a vessel, a body, and, like all bodies, it aged, it cracked, it healed slowly, it forgot things. Doors no longer fit their frames. Stairs bent under their own memory. Bells stopped ringing long before they broke, as though the tower was tired of echoing loss. Laurent, too, aged with it. He could not say which of them grew tired first, his bones or the monasteries. But he knew, deep down, that neither would outlast the other, that their ends were braided. When he swept the cloister walk, he wasn't cleaning stone. He was brushing the skin of something sacred. When he lit a candle, he wasn't banishing darkness. He was feeding the breath of a dying house. The rule said the monastery was to be maintained with reverence, cleaned, tended, protected. Laurent did all of that. But more than that, he cared for it, as one cares for a beloved parent in decline, with dignity, with patience, with the quiet grief of watching something forget how to be what it once was. And even as the walls flaked, and the roof sagged, and the rafters wept in the rain, he stayed. Not because he thought the place would be saved, but because it deserved someone who still noticed when it changed, and because no one should die alone, not even a monastery. Laurent's faith never lived in sermons. It lived in threadbare robes, in cracked bowls, in the way he folded his blanket each morning even when no one would see. It lived in repetition, in rhythm, in repair. He began, over time, to worship differently, not through grand prayers or soaring hymns, but through small things. He mended socks as if stitching salvation. He patched parchment with hands that trembled, not from holiness, but from the cold. He fixed a leaking eavespout with a strip of cloth and a prayer not for God, but for gravity. And in doing so, he came to believe gently, wordlessly, that faith might live best when no one looks, not in theology, in thresholds, in tools kept sharp, in candles extinguished with breath and care. He did not write these beliefs down. There was no doctrine to them, no revelation, just a growing sense that what mattered most was not what was believed, but how one behaved in the absence of clarity. He once found a spider spinning a web in the chalice. He didn't kill it, he moved it, whispered, "Not here." Not because the spider was wrong, but because the space still meant something. Even if no one drank from the cup anymore, even if no one watched. Laurent's theology was not about salvation. It was about attention, the kind of holy, aching attention that says, "This matters because I am choosing to care." And if that isn't prayer, then prayer never mattered anyway. In the final weeks of winter, Laurent stopped singing, not from defiance, from wear. His voice, once modest but steady, grew thinner. The notes cracked in his throat. Breath came with effort. Words specially sung once felt like too much weight for his lungs to carry, so he hummed instead. Low, tuneless vibrations, more rhythm than music. Not hymns, he remembered, exactly fragments of chants, bits of plain song, the rise and fall of psalms too old to trace. The monastery, long accustomed to silence, accepted this sound, welcomed it even. The echoes seemed to respond. Stone has memory, after all, he hummed while sweeping, while tending the fire that never quite lit, while copying a final manuscript he knew would not be finished. He hummed while pulling wilted herbs from frozen ground, while pouring water, while folding a robe that once belonged to someone whose name he forgot. And one day he hummed for no reason at all, just to hear himself, just to prove he could. There is a holiness in sound that expects nothing back, a hymn with no melody, a voice with no audience, a faith that hums even as it breaks. Laurent no longer hoped for revelation, but he hummed because something in him still moved toward the light, even if the light was imagined, even if it was memory, even if it was just the warmth of an old song curling back into his throat one last time. No lyrics, no harmony, just continuation. He didn't need more than that, and neither did the stones. There came a morning when Laurent did not rise, not from rebellion, not from choice, from stillness. The sun, shy behind winter clouds, crept slowly over the chapel roof. The bell did not ring, the psalms were not spoken. The rule, for the first time in decades, went unobserved. And yet, something remained. In his cell, the candle had burned down to nothing. The straw mattress bore the shape of a man who once believed in silence. The psalter lay open beside him, not to a final psalm, to a blank page, clean, unwritten. A space waiting, perhaps, for a prayer that was never meant to be spoken aloud, or a breath that was always enough on its own. Laurent's hands were folded, not by another, by himself, not in fear, in recognition. He had copied thousands of pages, lit hundreds of candles, swept the same stones until they forgot they were once part of a floor. And now, without fanfare, without miracle, without witness, he rested. Not like someone who had fallen, like someone who had arrived. No records were kept, no relics recovered, no feast day established. But in time, someone found the cell, felt the quiet, saw the blank page, and did not write on it. Because some endings are not meant to be finished. Some prayers are not meant to be heard. And some psalms are best left unwritten. The monastery, long emptied of its voices, continued to breathe, not in sound, in form. The cloister arches still curved in prayer. The chapel windows still filtered light into softened silence. The stones, mottled with lichen and age, held the outlines of footsteps long vanished. The world had moved on. Kings crowned, wars ended, faith fractured, machines sang. The old calendar collapsed into modernity. But this place, this one quiet place, kept its shape. Visitors came now and then, historians, hikers, the lost. Some took photographs, some left coins, some sat for hours, saying nothing, unsure why they felt more seen here than in the cities they came from. They didn't know the names of the monks. They didn't know the rule, but they felt something, not haunted, held. It wasn't the grandeur. There was none, just rubble and angles and the skeletal suggestion of ritual. But the dust remembered, in the way dust always does. It remembered the quills, the candles, the soft scrape of sandals across worn stone, the weight of a man pausing at a doorway he was not supposed to leave. It remembered the breath between prayers, the tiny sighs of someone who stayed too long at a window, watching a sky that never quite turned blue, the pages that stuck together in winter, the bowl with the beetle, the candle that burned anyway. No plaque marked these things, but the dust did, and in it, everything that mattered had settled not in legacy, but in layering, like ash from a fire no one witnessed, still warm if you pressed your hand just right. The rule of Saint Benedict was never meant to be famous. It was meant to be followed, not celebrated, not gilded in gold leaf, not dissected by scholars in glass buildings far from any chapel. It was a manual for quiet lives, a choreography of devotion, bound by humility, sharpened by repetition. Most who read it now do so with gloves. They turn its pages in temperature-controlled archives. They marvel at its endurance, its detail, its strangeness. No excessive laughter, it warns. Keep silence at meals. Sleep clothed with belts. They smile. They write essays. They miss the point, because the rule was never the words. It was the man who lived them. The one who washed robes long after he believed. The one who copied psalms for no one. The one who buried brothers and never spoke their names aloud, because silence was the only eulogy permitted. The rule was the breath he took before dawn, the moment he chose not to leave, the way he folded a robe he would never wear again. And though no one remembers Laurent not truly, not by name or miracle or canon, the rule remains etched in places paper can't hold, in the rhythm of places where no one speaks unless they mean it, in the stillness of gardens grown wild, in the echo of a bell that hasn't rung in centuries but still vibrates in the bones of the curious. The rule was never about sainthood, it was about staying. And in that act, in the stubborn, soft endurance of it, Laurent is remembered better than any monument could allow. In the National Library of France, a manuscript lives in quiet obscurity. It is shelved not with relics, but with routine, a book among books. Its leather binding is cracked, its pages brittle, its content unremarkable. Psalms, sermons, some herbal remedies, marginalia. But if you read closely, between the lines, a voice emerges, not a loud one. A voice used to silence. It appears in fragments, in crooked Latin, in dry jokes scribbled next to dire theology, in complaints about cold ink and misbehaving parchment. One margin reads, "If I make a mistake, may it be blessed with meaning." Another, "Too many rats today. I suspect judgment." Scholars don't notice these lines at first. They're not looking for people. They're looking for patterns. But one day, a student tired, half asleep, translating out of duty more than passions, stumbles across a page that stops her cold. A single line in the bottom margin, written in a slightly steadier hand. "I am still here." It's not attributed. It doesn't belong to the psalm. It's not part of the rule, but something in it lives. The student copies it down, not as data, as a message, a heartbeat across centuries. She writes it in the back of her notebook. Then, later, on a slip of paper taped above her bed. She doesn't know who wrote it, but she feels less alone reading it. And that is the point. Some voices don't echo loudly. They settle into margins. Wait for someone tired enough, lonely enough, curious enough to notice. And when they're found, they don't shout. They whisper, "I stayed. I endured. I am still here." No one tends it now. No one weeds. No one waters. But the monastery garden still grows. Not neatly, not obediently. The old rows are gone, swallowed by moss and time. The paths are uneven. The gate leans at an angle that suggests it has forgotten what it means to open. But something green insists. Mint spreads unchecked, thick and fragrant. Rosemary clings on, gnawed but alive. Wild thyme clusters between stones, where once monks walked in quiet procession. The soil, once turned by hands long gone, still remembers what it was asked to do, grow, and so it does. Visitors rarely linger here. They walk the cloister. They peer into the chapel. But the garden feels too ordinary to marvel at, unless you sit, unless you listen. Because, in the hush between wind and birdsong, the garden speaks, not in language, in rhythm. You can almost hear the scrape of a hoe, the muttered psalm, the weary breath of someone fasting and faithful, kneeling in the dirt to tend what would never feed him. It is not a beautiful garden. It never was. But it is alive. And in that, it is sacred. Somewhere beneath the overgrowth, a shallow grave sinks gently, unmarked, no plaque, no cross, just a slight hollow. Perhaps Laurent lies there, perhaps not. It doesn't matter, because he is here, in the mint, in the shadow of rosemary, in the silence that says, softly but clearly, something was cared for here, and even now, the garden blooms for no one. Because that's what it was taught to do. And what is devotion, if not that? At the center of the cloister, there's a single stone that no one notices, worn flat by centuries of sandals, smoothed to a shine by weather and time. It has no inscription, no cross, no carving, but it marks something, a turning point, a place where feet once paused. Laurent used to stand here each morning before prime, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the day stretch out ahead of him. He never lingered. The rule didn't allow for delay. But in that instant, barely more than a breath, he remembered himself. Not the monk, not the copyist, just the man. And the stone remembers him, not his face, his weight. The pressure of a foot hesitant, then certain. Visitors walk past it now. They take photos of the arches, whisper in the chapel. brush their hands along the old sundial. But this stone, they step over it, unaware, and that is as it should be, because not all markers are meant to be noticed. Some are meant to be felt. The way a voice fades but leaves behind an echo. The way silence carries shape even after the speaker is gone. The way faith presses gently into the world and asks for nothing in return, only to be allowed to stay. And here, in this stone, that stay is honored, not loudly, not forever, just enough. There are no clocks here, there never were. Time in the monastery was measured in bells, in prayers, in the slow unraveling of candlelight. Now, even those are gone. What remains is something older, thicker, a night without edges. After midnight, the world does not sleep, it waits. The stones hold their breath, the wind quiets. The chapel sits like a mouth closed around a final word. Even the garden is still, its leaves turned inward, listening for footsteps that never come. And yet something watches, not a ghost, not a god, just the idea of someone. Laurent, perhaps, or the shape of him. A memory stitched into shadow. A presence not haunting, but habitual. You feel it when you stand where he stood, when your breath fogs in the chapel, when your fingers brush the worn groove of a prayer bench, and you wonder not what was said there, but who said it so often the wood forgot its original grain. The night does not ask anything of you, it does not seek reverence, only awareness. To walk these halls in darkness is to understand the faith of the forgotten, not the canonized, not the celebrated, but the ones who stayed behind, who lit the final candle, who buried the last brother, who copied the last psalm and whispered it into the quiet, not to be heard, but to prove that they still could. Laurent never left a testimony, but the air here still bends round his name. If you say it aloud, nothing answers, but the silence nods, because the monastery did not die when the last monk did. It only fell asleep. And in this hour, this hush before dawn that never quite arrives, it dreams of ink, of frost, of someone who once hummed a hymn just to hear it echo back. In the remains of the chapel, near what was once the altar, lies a single candle, unburned, dust-covered, tipped slightly to one side, like it fell asleep waiting for hands that never came. No one remembers who placed it there. Perhaps it was always meant to be lit for someone who never arrived, or perhaps it was left as a promise, a future vigil, a flame for a sorrow still on its way. It never fulfilled its purpose, and yet it remains. Laurent never lit it. He saw it once, during a particularly dark morning, when the sky refused even the thinnest light. He considered striking it, warming his fingers by it, baptizing it with the last match in the monastery. But he didn't, not from piety, from reverence. Not every candle is meant to burn. Some are meant to wait, to hold space for grief not yet named, for prayers too afraid to rise, for arrivals that never come, and for those who left so slowly they forgot to say goodbye. The candle has outlived everything else. The psalters, the brothers, the bells. It doesn't mark time anymore. It keeps it like a clock with no hands, a sentence with no end. It reminds the chapel what devotion once looked like. Even unlit, it glows, not visibly, but in potential, and perhaps that is holier than fire. To be ready, always, to sit in darkness, not with fear, but with quiet willingness, to say, with every silent second, if someone needs me, I will shine, even if no one ever does. No one knows how it got there, tucked between two warped beams beneath the chapel floor. just parchment, rolled, bound with twine that disintegrates when touched, found only because the floor sagged slightly, and someone, perhaps a restorer, perhaps a pilgrim with careful shoes, noticed the give of old wood. The psalm written there isn't complete. It begins in the middle. Though I walk through the valley, and stops. No, of the shadow of death. No, I will fear no evil. Just the beginning of movement, the breath before faith. The hand that wrote it was small, precise, a scribe's hand, but not ceremonial, not practiced. This was not copied, this was confessed. Maybe Laurent wrote it, maybe not. Maybe it was one of the others, Henry, who laughed during Lent, Arnaud, who gave away his bread, the novice whose name no one remembered, but whose cough outlasted Compline. It doesn't matter. What matters is that someone, in the dark, bent low enough to press hope into the bones of the place, not where it could be seen, where it could be held. The parchment is cracked now. The ink bleeds. Scholars debate its age, its authorship, its worth. But one visitor, eyes full of winter light, kneels beside the exposed beam and whispers the rest of the line, softly, not to God, to the floor, to the silence, to the one who wrote the beginning and trusted someone else would carry it. In the early hours, those deepest folds of night, when the world forgets its own turning, the wind arrives. Not loud, not fierce, a presence more than a force. It slips through the broken panes of the chapel, moves through the garden without disturbing a single stem, weaves between cloister arches like it remembers the path better than any monk ever did. It is not aimless. It is remembering. It catches on the edges of stone, those old grooves worn smooth by barefoot, mornings and funeral processions whispered into routine. It circles the bell tower, now hollow, now host to nothing but pigeons and time. And sometimes, just sometimes, it hums. Not quite a tune, not quite a voice, but close enough to make the hair lift at the nape of your neck. Close enough to sound like someone, somewhere, is still keeping the hours. Some say it's a trick of acoustics. Others say it's the last prayer, rising endlessly in the air, too light to fall, too faithful to fade. But the wind knows. The wind remembers what devotion sounds like. It carries the rhythm of the rule, long after the words are gone. The breath before matins, the chant before dusk, the sigh of a man who stayed because someone had to. The wind does not mourn, it witnesses, and in doing so becomes the last psalm, unwritten, unspoken, unending. There is no conclusion, no saint's day, no canonization, no marble inscription beneath a golden dome. Laurent left behind no miracles, only pattern-squired repetitions that shaped the soul like water-carved stone. The world, in its endless hurry, moved past him, but the monastery did not. It remembers him not in name, but in behavior, in the shape of the silence, in the weight of an unlit candle, in the stillness of a page never written. And so the night remains, not because dawn refuses to come, but because some stories are meant to be walked through, not exited. Because not every monk escapes his cloister, not even in death. Because some prayers never end, they only slow into breath. If you find yourself awake at an hour when the world feels hollow, when the lamp flickers low, when the walls seem to lean in, listening, know this, you are not alone. A man once lived by rules no one reads now. He sang for no audience. He swept a cloister floor with a devotion that no history book considered worthy of mention. He lit a candle, he waited, he stayed, and in doing so, he made the silence sing. No final bell marked his end, Only the quiet, only the page, only the last word in the dark, which was not a name, not even a prayer, just a breath. Thank you for keeping me company tonight. If this story meant something to you, if it helped you feel a little more understood, a little more at peace, or simply helped you fall asleep, then I'm grateful. You're always welcome here. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like more stories like this, told slowly and with care. And if you're still awake, I'd love to know where you're listening from, or what time it is for you right now. But for now, rest well, and good night.